Open University.
9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4.
Good afternoon. Welcome to another episode of the Open University, and I'm still in Rangoon. I'm still in Myanmar, formerly Burma, and I'm still living out the consequences, which are quite delightful, of that moment. I decided not to take my Amsterdam flight and instead to take one to Vientiane in Laos, which after a couple of weeks I began to feel I was spending too much time in. That has not occurred here in Rangoon. I'm actually really loving this city and really not ever wanting to leave, at the moment anyway. And it just seems like an ideal place to... it has a kind of ideal combination of everything that I like. It's got a kind of liveliness because I'm right in the heart of Chinatown, as I was when I lived in Manhattan, actually. So it's not dissimilar in some way to a summery Manhattan experience, although here we're right in the middle of winter and it's 35 degrees every day. That's taking some adjusting to, the very thought that you could escape from the winter. It reminds me of the beginning of My Family and Other Animals by Gerald Durrell, where Larry is described as saying, I've spent a week in London running from my life from a barrage of cold germs, everyone sneezing and snuffling like a brood of catarrhal bulldogs. You have to remember the Durrells were people who were born, although they were British citizens, they were born in India and they chose to live in Corfu, at least for some of the time. And I have a similarly itinerant background childhood because my father worked for the British Council, so we went in 1969 to live in Greece, in Athens, and the British Council, the library, Kolonaki Square, that became like a backdrop to my life there, or the British Embassy School, St. Catherine's, which I went to. And so basically I have this sort of mentality of the expat. George Orwell, of course, also was a policeman in Burma and wrote his two books actually about Burma. And there is this cosmopolitanism which Britain used to have because of the empire, which now we have for other reasons. We have because of inward immigration from the ex-colonies into Britain, making it a much more cosmopolitan society than it ever would have been in those days, but also the instant cosmopolitanism of the internet, which makes everywhere kind of on the same level. And that the amazing thing when you think about the conditions that prevail here in Rangoon right now, in Yangon, is that they wouldn't even have been possible a couple of years ago. I would not have been able to take money out of ATMs, and I would not have been able to upload videos to YouTube even a couple of years ago here. So there's this amazing sudden flattening of the experience of someone based here and the experience of someone based basically anywhere. And that really makes me think, why do I even need to think about living in Europe or Japan or America? And thinking about the differences between those places and here. First of all, the idea of a kind of bohemian lifestyle is not really possible in those European cities anymore. Henry Miller might have lived a certain lifestyle in Paris in the 30s, but you couldn't live that way in Paris now. At least I don't think you could. Some people are literally bohemians in Prague. Some friends of mine are bohemians in Prague, where it's still relatively cheap. But that's for Europe. Everything is relative about wealth and poverty. I'm a precarian by all Western measures, but here in Yangon, I'm a rich person, and it gives me the sense of what it must be like to be a member of the 1%. That being able to basically, do things without thinking of how much they'll cost. Makes you feel rich, and being able to have a fantastic meal for €1. I felt slightly ripped off when the bicycle taxi demanded 10,000 cut for a fairly short trip. I was being ripped off because that would, if I'd been a local person, that would have cost me 10 cents, but I was charged $8 for it. But still, that's a relatively insignificant sum, and everything else has been very cheap. I've had some other weird encounters, like with a gay shopkeeper who chased me out of the most Western style shopping centre in Yangon, and insisted, walking down a city block with me, insisted that I was gay, that he knew I was gay even if I didn't, and that he was going to fuck me at 6 o'clock as soon as he closed his shop. I kept saying, I'm straight, and if you have a sister, send her, this kind of eventually got rid of him. So there've been a couple of weird encounters, but mostly people have been very sweet, and they go out of their way to help you, and you feel very privileged here. So it is a question of, could I live here? What do I need in my life? What do I miss? And what are the differences between this developing country and the sort of developed countries that I know so well? First of all, the population profile is pretty different here. There's a lot more young people. Things like air and water are not trustworthy. That's the downside of it. The air quality is pretty bad. It's quite toxic air and toxic water. I spent the first, good 10 days or so feeling a bit queasy, but I think my innards have now adapted themselves to the bugs in the water. So I'm feeling physically much better now, and I'm not missing the sort of aseptic Swiss quality, that sort of anemic quality of life in rich cities and countries. There is an inhibition and a sublimation which creates things like culture. There are no contemporary art museums here at all. There's nothing like that. There's nothing that. I mean, the good part of that kind of I'm calling it Swiss as a kind of shorthand, Swiss lifestyle that you get in the West, is that at the very top of that, there are some amazing things like architecture. I've been looking at Japanese architecture magazines. This was one of the few things I would go downtown in Osaka to look at. Would be it's this architecture magazine called Jutaku Tokushu, which is new constructions house building, and the kind of environments in that which don't have the kind of bling and the kind of ostentation of Western designs, but are kind of nicely humble and small scale, but very fresh contemporary architecture. But even that is beginning to get a little bit staid and conservative and retro looking in its architectural styles. I'm not convinced that the West, and I'm sort of including Japan in that category now, is in its best place now. I think it's cautious and inward looking, and it doesn't really have the courage of its convictions anymore. Obviously, a lot of people right now are probably thinking, Americans are thinking, Jesus, I don't want to bring up my children in this country where school shootings happen, or anytime someone like Trump gets elected, people think we're going to move to Canada. Why move to Canada when you could move to a developing country? I mean, that begins to be the question. Why doesn't everybody move to a city like Yangon? I wouldn't have said that about Hanoi, with severe problems with the traffic, snarling everything up. I wouldn't have said that about Vientiane, which is a combination of underdeveloped and boring on the one hand, and kind of overdeveloped in terms of, there's a sort of Magaluf style Mallorcan tourist development there called Cowboy City, for instance, where they were. It's a nightmare environment where young tourists were spending money on street food and drinking and listening to terrible cover bands playing Cranberries covers, So that was developing in the wrong direction. Money coming in and turning it into something else. But that doesn't seem to be happening here in Yangon. Here in Yangon, especially in Chinatown, you have the energy, you have all the best elements of developing world energy apparently without the downsides. Obviously the health aspects are the downside though. The fact that you can't breathe clean air here, there's pollution of all sorts. And it's apparently unsafe according to the Economist Intelligence Unit. But the idea of being provincial, I think, has gone out the window with iPhones and with good internet connections. I don't think it's possible to be provincial anymore, and that is a huge new horizon. I mean, if you think of the Darrells going to Corfu, or I recently rewatched Paul Bowles' documentary about Bowles going to Tangier and writing there, and that was in a sense deliberately cutting yourself off from the world. I guess he would go and read newspapers and things down in the city square. He'd probably have a 3 or 4 day old American or British paper he could read, or French paper, the International Herald Tribune or something. But you would be essentially cutting yourself off in a way that you can't anymore. It's very difficult now, should you even want to do that, short of becoming a monk, So this idea of the non-provincial, and it's also not a place where you're even cut off from See, the kind of things that I would see in contemporary art shows would probably look like installations like you would see on the street here. They're just sort of arrangements of fruit and sort of colourful plastic objects, or the kind of books you would find in second-hand bookstores here. The other day I found a whole new street at 37th Street, which is all second-hand book stalls and shops, full of exactly the kind of dusty paperbacks that I enjoy, old literature. So I've now got this huge heap, this growing stack of classic literature, the kind that I get so excited by. So it's exactly my kind of city in the sense that that's all available too. You've got the internet, you've got great weather every day. It's sunny and 35 degrees, which might be too hot for some people. Actually, it's fine. I find there's a fresh breeze which keeps it cool. We're right in the middle of Chinese New Year here today, so that's livening things up. The traffic tends to be in gridlock, which means it's quite easy to cross the road because there's no motorbikes weaving in between the blocked cars. They're all just stopped in the middle of the road. So you can walk quite easily across the city despite the gridlock or because of it. So it's kind of I keep using this term sweet spot, but it is kind of in a sweet spot for me. It's got a kind of flaneur culture in the sense of having very cheap and pleasant tea shops everywhere where you can drink chai and leave through your second-hand insect-infested paperbacks and things. So I don't know, maybe this could be, the new Tangier, the new Alexandria for Lawrence Durrell, the new Paris for Henry Miller, a kind of city where you could get work done. There isn't a peer group really here. There is a kind of gentrification going on. There are some galleries I discovered, like Gallery Myanmar. There's a street called Bogolese Street, which is kind of slightly gentrified in the way that really I've only seen on that one street in the city. There's a place called Pariboga. Pariboga means furniture in Burmese, and it's a kind of teak furniture modern design store run by a foreigner who has another store in Hong Kong, I think. And they also serve coffee and food. So I've seen some British people in there eating lunch, kind of quite affluent corporate type people, whose conversations seem to involve how much better Yangon is than, say, Dhaka. They really hated Dhaka in Bangladesh. Next to that, there's a place called Pansaria, which used to be a photography gallery and then became a restaurant. There's actually very good food in there. I found it slightly snooty, the atmosphere in there, so I tend to eat in more street foodie places now that my stomach has settled down. But if you want gentrification and art galleries and things, I mean, a lot of that cultural life here is organised by the cultural institutions like the Goethe Institute, which is actually moving between two buildings right now, but still doing exhibitions, has a show opening in a couple of days about Burmese photography. The British Council, it's kind of heartbreaking to see the kind of books the British Council throws out. The ones that end up in the bookstalls that I go to in the Yangon Book Plaza, it's kind of heartbreaking because they have this... They have labels inside a motto which says, "Truth will triumph." British Council, truth will triumph. And it reminds you of the sort of aspirational times before the British Council became essentially a souped-up language college. I mean, the Tokyo one is tragic, because in Tokyo it's right next door to the French Institute, which has got a fantastic library, cafe, gift shop, and is a wonderful place to visit to get a sense of Frenchness. Whereas the British Council has... it's got like metal detectors at the door, and it's sort of defensiveness. Even the one here has big concrete blocks to make sure people are not driving bomb trucks up to the door. But this constant sense of being under attack, which Anglo-Saxon countries seem to have. But also the sense that they've scrapped the library. The one in Tokyo no longer even has a library. They just have classrooms, and they just charge people to learn the English language. That's their one remaining asset, is the English language. A lot of these bookshops are full of language learning materials, and a lot of the textbooks you're seeing, the kind of literature stuff you're seeing in these bookshops is from courses which presumably don't even exist any longer, because I think most of the courses now are sort of business English and nautical or scientific English, very specialised. But the French Institute also is a bit far out. I went out there and looked at a very nice little library, but a bit far from the centre, and you have to show your passport to get into all these places. So, but they seem to be the only places with libraries and the only places that are sponsoring culture. So, but I'm not really missing. I'm not thinking to myself, gee, I wish this place had, like Seoul, Korea, for instance, has fantastic contemporary art places, and is keeping up in that sense with the Western um, museums and galleries and things. Here there is one state-run museum, which is interesting, and that's pretty much it. There's a zoo. I went to the zoo, which is kind of a place where couples go to court, apparently. Lots of couples spooning on benches there. And yet the streets, as I said in the last episode, the streets seem very creative in a sort of new romantic way. And it seems like there's just this explosion of colour on every street, certainly in Chinatown. And it makes the West look too tidy, too clean, too Swiss, full of dead space and sort of pseudo-luxury. So I'm thinking probably Singapore would be a bit Western in that sense as well. It would be too clean and too boring, too administrative, too... even Bangkok now is trying to clear the street food off the streets. You know, they have a campaign, just as Osaka has a campaign against bicycles. You know, they seize on the best elements of their cities and actually try to expel them in the interests of hygiene or order or whatever it is. Here, to the credit of this place, and I don't want to credit the military regime too much, but you have to say it is fantastically deregulated, unregulated, a kind of chaos. The streets are a kind of chaos, which goes through chaos into a kind of new order, a new kind of order, which works. Like, for instance, the gridlock traffic turning into something that's very easy to get across, or the street food everywhere, you know, making it just very pleasant and very easy to get whatever you want, whenever you want it, on whichever street you're on. So, yeah, it's making me question all sorts of things which I took for granted, and making me enjoy being relatively affluent. I suppose it's kind of selfish feeling, but also, you know, why would you live in... When I look at the temperatures prevailing right now in New York or London or Paris, you know, or Scotland for that matter, you know, it's freezing, it's grey, and everything's overpriced there. Why would you get into that kind of treadmill of paying so much to be in such a miserable place, and to be in the middle of winter when you could escape winter? You know, this is the question. I don't seem to get tired of it. I mean, basically every day I go out and find something new which reaffirms my faith in the city as just an incredibly pleasant place to be right now. So that's pretty much it for today. See you next time.
Open University.